Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 5. Kvath Kemaf Avdu Emer. What Came of the Fire. His eyes snapped open. River took in his surroundings. He lay on a bed in a small room. He was clothed, but barefoot. Thoughts tumbled through his brain. What happened? Where am I? Where is Willow? He felt her presence near him. She was calm. His breathing evened out. Moving his limbs, he found his hands were sore and bandaged. He glanced down at his legs and saw that his feet were likewise bandaged. Sitting up carefully, he groaned. The clothes on him smelled like smoke and sweat, and his eyes stung slightly. There was a candle on the dresser at the foot of his bed. Extending a hand, he ignited the wick with a word of ley magic, and then searched the room for his boots. Finding them under the bed, he began strapping them on, but stopped abruptly. His hands stung when he tried to grab the laces. He unwrapped the bandages and gaped at the cuts on his palms. With a thought, River pushed a bit of his magic to the flesh in his hands, knitting them back together. He wondered why he hadn't done so immediately after he had gashed them. Slightly discolored skin was soon all that remained of the wounds. After doing the same to his feet, River flexed his toes and carefully stood up. He could hear muffled voices. Using a hurried weave of magic upon the closed door, he looked through it into the adjacent room at what was taking place. The image shimmered and rippled like the surface of water. A tall Olma buck was speaking with a red-haired man. Both sat at a table pushed against a wall. They occasionally sipped from cups as they talked. A couple packs leaned against the wall, and various other items had been piled on top of them. Concentrating, he quickly listened to their conversation. "Been out for a whole day now," the buck was saying to the man. "I'm worried about River." The man sitting across from him nodded and took a swig from the cup in his hand. He swallowed and spoke. "Abigail says that they're both healthy. She can't tell why Edmund won't wake up." River shifted his weight. Who was Edmund? He thought to himself. Did he suffer the same fate that... His memories shifted suddenly in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath in shock. The spell form on the door disintegrated, vanishing into the air. Jupe and Oak rushed into the room and helped Edmund onto the bed. "Are you all right, River?" huffed Oak. "We were worried about you. Willow has been asking for you since she woke up a couple hours ago." Jupe shoved in front of Oak and asked, "How are you feeling, Ed? You've been out cold for the better part of a day." He looked up at the candle on the dresser. "I'm sorry. If I had known you wanted a little light, I would have brought a few more candles in." He stopped, a puzzled expression on his face. "How did you light the candle?" Edmund looked over at the little flame. It flickered slightly. "I didn't," he said. A voice from the living room called out, "He's awake!" A woman bustled into the room and grabbed Edmund's face in both her hands. Using her thumbs, she pulled his eyes open. "You seem fine. That's good." Turning his hands over so she could see his palms, she muttered a small gasp. "Your hands!" She looked down at his feet and then back into his eyes, squinting slightly. Her eyes had small lines around them and were a wonderfully deep blue. Freckles dotted her nose and cheeks. Her curly hair was a rusty blonde and was held back in a tail with a piece of leather. Jupe stood up and put a hand on her shoulder. His eyes were locked onto Edmund's hands, where the wounds should have been. Edmund was as surprised as they were. He distinctly remembered gripping Willow's antlers so hard that his hands were cut open on the ridges. He remembered cutting his feet on sharp sticks as he ran out into the field. Now, where the gashes and cuts had been, there was smooth, healthy skin. Another memory stirred in his head, an old, strange-sounding Yordic word, Eslinweir. A shiver quivered down his spine. Jupe recovered himself and looked up at Edmund. "Edmund, this is Abigail." He gave her shoulder a little squeeze. "She's the herbalist in Rockford." Edmund managed a smile and shook Abigail's hand. "Thank you for looking after me," he said. Abigail smiled back and laughed. "Looks like you took better care of yourself than I did." She held one of his hands up at eye level. "How did you do this? I would be happy if you could teach Jupe this spell." I can't use magic, but he can. It would be an amazing thing to have a healer in town." Edmund shrugged and smiled weakly. "Wish I could, believe me, but I didn't do this. I woke up on the floor, and my wounds were already healed." Oak stood up and went into the other room, probably to tell Willow the news. Edmund continued, "You said that I was out for the whole day?" He looked out the window in his room. The sun was sinking below the tree line again. He looked up at Jupe. "They burned all the wheat." Jupe sat down next to him and slapped him on the back. "Don't worry about it," he said with a smile that Edmund could tell was forced. "There was a bundle or two on the bottom that survived. Got enough money to get me through this year. Besides, I still have the mill. The other farmers will be paying me for its use in the next few days, so I'll have that income to help me." Abigail stood up angrily. "That damned fool," she growled. "He'll pay for what he's done." Jupe sighed. "No, he won't, Abigail," he said softly. "He's got the town behind him. He can basically do whatever he wants, and no one will do anything to stop him." She gave an exasperated sigh, moved over to his side, and grabbed one of his hands. "He doesn't have the whole town behind him. This won't ruin you, Jupe." She squeezed his hand. "I'll be heading home now that both of them are awake. I know that Willow and Oak are leaving tomorrow, but Edmund should come into town and stop by my shop. I just want to make sure he's all right." Jupe nodded, but then frowned and said, "Actually, I don't think either of us should go into town tomorrow." He trailed off. Abigail arched an eyebrow disapprovingly. "Don't you give him the satisfaction of driving you up a tree, Jupe," she scolded. "You had better come to town tomorrow. If I don't see you, I'll send Martin out here to drag you into town." Her grip on his hand tightened as she spoke. "Theod has to know that you won't be cowed." Giving Jupe's hand one final squeeze, she smiled at Edmund and headed to the door. Jupe patted Edmund on the back and said, "Glad you're feeling better, Ed. You should get some rest tonight. I guess we're going into town tomorrow." He left the room and partially closed the door behind him. Edmund peeked through the crack and saw Jupe and Abigail talking at the door. Abigail stood up on her toes and gave Jupe a quick kiss on his cheek, and then left. Jupe watched her leave with a grin on his face. Edmund chuckled to himself and stood up. Moving over toward the window, he looked out into the evening sky. Deep orange and purple stained the clouds, and the silhouette of the forest was black against them. Edmund stared at his reflection in the window pane. His presence here had cost Jupe his crop. He knew that he couldn't stay. Theod had issued Jupe a warning, and Edmund knew that it was up to him to make sure events didn't spiral into further disaster. Tapping his fingers on the windowsill, he considered his options. Going to town tomorrow would be a mistake. He knew this. If Edmund left before then, Jupe would still go into Rockford. He had told Abigail that he would, and Edmund doubted that he would go back on his word, especially to her. Theod would see that he was alone and guess that Edmund had left. He would probably send one of his cronies to the farm to make sure. "That settles it," Edmund sighed, and turned back to his room. Heading into the living space, he found Jupe sitting at the table with a book in his hands. Edmund strolled over to him. "Where's Willow?" he asked. "She's in my room," answered Jupe, looking up from the book. "She woke up a few hours before you did. She's a little weak still, but she'll be all right." He closed his book and turned in his seat towards Edmund. "Look here, Ed. That was an amazing bit of magic you pulled off yesterday." Edmund shrugged and sat down across from Jupe. "I don't know how I did it." He absent-mindedly poked at the book in front of Jupe, who continued. "Doesn't matter if you remember how you did it or not. Don't you see? You pulled an Olma out of the grip of the wild spirit. No one in history has ever done that before. You should have seen it. Light was flashing out from both of you. The ground was shaking." Jupe gestured enthusiastically with his hands as he spoke. "I thought you were just a soldier, but I was wrong. You must be someone incredibly powerful. Perhaps a mage, maybe even from the Weirding Guild." Edmund cut him off. "Stormhand," he said quietly, eyes on the book at his fingertips. Jupe stared at him. "My name is Edmund Stormhand. I don't really know who that is, but I remember using magic as naturally as I breathe. I remember the feel of it coursing through my body, the elation of enhanced sensation and strength brought on by the power." Edmund looked up into Jupe's eyes. "I remember that, Jupe. I can't make it work. I know that I can, but I don't know how to make it work." Jupe stroked his jaw in thought as he searched Edmund's face with his gaze. "We'll figure it out, Ed," he said reassuringly. "We'll talk about it tomorrow afternoon when we get back from town." Edmund looked away from Jupe, back down at the book. "That's another thing, Jupe. I'm not staying." At this, Jupe shifted and leaned forward to protest, but Edmund continued. "Look, I've put you through enough danger already. Just go out to your field and look around. My being here is putting you at risk. Can't have that weighing on me. I'm grateful for all you've done for me, but I'm leaving tomorrow morning. I won't be going into town with you either. You and I both know that would only make things worse. I'm going to ask Oak and Willow if I can go back with them to their tribe in the Witchwood. I'll try getting my memory back there." He stopped abruptly. "Willow." He realized that he could feel her. He could sense where she was. He looked over and found himself staring at the wooden door leading into Jupe's room. Edmund squinted. He could sense that she was happy that he was awake and all right. Jupe, who had taken Edmund's silence to mean that he was finished, began to speak. "Now hold on, Edmund. You can't just leave. We're so close to finding out who you are. I promised that I would help you, remember? Who cares if Theod stirs up the town? I promised that I would help you, and I don't go back on my word. Not for anything." Edmund turned his attention back to Jupe and shook his head. "I've made up my mind, Jupe. I'm leaving. It's too dangerous for you to help me. They burned your crop for Hammer's sake. What do you think they'll do next? No, it's too much." Edmund stood to go back to his room. Jupe caught his arm with a hand. "You can't leave, Ed! Your memories!" Edmund shook Jupe's hand off his arm and growled. "My memories are not worth your life, Jupe. End of discussion. I'm leaving." He whirled around and stalked back to the guest room. Jupe cursed. "Baal's blood!" He leaped up and called after Edmund. "I know who you are!" Edmund froze. Turning slowly, he looked back at Jupe, who was standing there facing him. He had gone pale. "I don't believe you," he said, staring at him intently. With a frightened look in his eyes, Jupe spoke. "It's true. I've been trying to ease you into your memory. You know how it is. If you remembered everything all at once, it would kill you." Edmund was finding it hard to breathe. He was furious with Jupe for holding back, but another part of him almost understood. "I still don't believe you," he said, shaking his head in denial. His gaze fell to the floor and he grabbed at a dresser to steady himself. He felt sick. "What's my name?" he said softly. Jupe shuffled awkwardly and looked out the window. "What is my name?" shouted Edmund, hands clenched into fists at his side. He felt a sudden wave of concern emanate from Willow in the other room. Jupe licked his lips nervously and said in a small voice, "Eslinweir." Edmund's knees buckled. He fell to the floor as memories flooded into his mind. He opened his eyes. He was once again laying on his bed. Jupe sat next to him, chin propped up on his hands, staring at nothing in particular. He noticed Edmund moving. Without turning, said, "I'm sorry, my friend. I made a poor decision by not telling you. I hope you can forgive me." Edmund sat up slowly. "Oh, I should be apologizing. You made the right choice. The memories are too powerful. I faint like a scared goat pretty much every time I remember something." He turned to Jupe, who still wasn't looking at him. "You sure you want to do this? It's dangerous, that much is clear." Jupe sighed and turned back to Edmund. "I promised you I would help get your memory back. I already know who you are, your history. I know how old you are. Trust me, it's worth a little risk." Edmund nodded. "Very well then," he said. "I'll stay." That night, Edmund couldn't sleep. He kept saying his name to himself over and over, feeling the syllables flow across his tongue. No matter how many times he said it, the words still seemed foreign to him. Jupe knew who he was. He would remember everything if he stayed. All he had to do was to keep the townsfolk from lynching them both. He huffed a mirthless laugh, ran his hands over his eyes, and hoped that no one had hidden after setting fire to the weed bundles. If Theod got word of what had happened between him and Willow, he would have enough fuel to whip the town into a frenzied mob. He hoped no one had seen his display of ley magic. He finally gave up on trying to sleep, and quietly made his way through the living room and out the front door onto the porch. Jupe and Oak were sleeping next to the fire burning in the stove. He made sure not to wake them. Edmund stood outside on the porch and gazed up into the starry night. The air still smelled of smoke. He breathed in the cool air and tried to sort out his thoughts. His mind turned again to Willow. He had some connection with her. He could feel her emotion. He could sense her somehow. Behind him. Arms circled around his shoulders and pulled him into a tight embrace from behind. A soft, earthy scent filled his nostrils. He felt Willow's warm breath in his hair. The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, pressed against each other. Neither of them spoke at once. The connection went both ways. Edmund sighed. "I can feel you, Glathelmere." The arms around his shoulders and chest tightened slightly at his voice. Willow softly nuzzled the back of his head with her nose. "Die you," she said warmly, "Eslinweir." Edmund shuddered at the sound of his name. Breathing deeply, he asked, "Did you tell Jupe that name?" Willow shook her head. "I told no one, not even my brother." "Then I will stay," Edmund said, half to himself. Willow's embrace tightened once again, and she sighed. I hoped you'd make that decision. I think that it's for the best, although I would have gladly brought you back with me to the Witchwood if you had asked. You would have been happy there. Edmund thought for a moment and then spoke. Did you see anything when our minds were one? I saw flashes of your life, your memories. Willow sighed. Yes, but I remember only your name. Everything else was like flashes of lightning, so loud and bright. When I saw the memories inside of you, I felt like a little fawn again, cowering from a thunderstorm. Can't recall them now, though I have tried. Edmund grunted and remained silent. Willow took a deep breath and then spoke. I have been thinking about the Eastern Wildkin. Let me tell you of your namesake. Perhaps it will satisfy some of your curiosity. Well, that wraps up part 1. Make sure you tune in for part 2 later this week. And in the meantime, leave a comment and a like. If you can't wait for part 2, then you can head on over to Amazon and purchase the full-length book there. Or you can click on the link down below. I'll see you all next time, but until then, enjoy the adventure.